Well, the U.S. State Department now says that it has reason to believe that the coronavirus actually was contracted by workers at the Wuhan virology lab months before the Chinese have claimed that the coronavirus first emerged in the world. In fact, all the way back to the fall of 2019. Now, if this claim is true, being made again by our State Department, then that backs up reporting that I've done for months that indicates not only that the COVID-19 virus did not originate in nature but was created in a lab, but that it was funded by who else? The U.S. government. I'm Ben Swan, and this is Truth in Media. Well, welcome to the show, guys. So much to get to today because I want to talk about this very latest announcement by the U.S. State Department that indicates and backs up reporting I've done for months about the origins of the coronavirus, where it came from, and about the Chinese government working to block their investigation into the idea that certain workers at the Wuhan virology lab actually contracted the COVID-19 virus all the way back in the fall of 2019. We're going to get to all that in just a moment, but before we do, a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, CreateTailwind.com. If you are tired of the banking system as it exists today and you're ready to secede from that system, you got to talk to the guys at Create Tailwind. Create Tailwind will teach you 5 different methods for being able to break away from the current banking system. The most important of which is something called infinite banking, the ability to bank on yourself the way that Fortune 500 companies and wealthy individuals do. You got to talk to Jim Oliver and Bob Burnett over at Create Tailwind. They will teach you how to learn to bank on yourself. CreateTailwind.com. So back to these new revelations by the U.S. State Department, and here's what we're learning. That the State Department on Friday night came out and said that they had reason to believe scientists in Wuhan, China may have been infected with the coronavirus in the autumn of 2019, but Beijing has worked hard to prevent a transparent investigation into the origins of the virus. In a statement, the agency came out and said that essentially those workers at the Wuhan lab appeared to have had a virus that had the same kind of symptoms and indicators that COVID-19 has. Quote, the Chinese Communist Party has prevented independent journalists, investigators, and global health authorities from interviewing researchers at the WIV, including those who were ill in the fall of 2019, the State Department said. Any credible inquiry into the origin of the virus must include interviews with these researchers and a full accounting of their previously unreported illness. But according to the State Department, and this is so important, guys, because when the Facebook fact checkers and Instagram fact checkers and YouTube fact checkers say that this report is a lie, the U.S. State Department now says and admits that we do not know the origin of where the coronavirus came from. And if we do not know the answer to that, then it cannot be misinformation to question where it may have come from. And by the way, everything the State Department is now saying about where it might have come from backs up reporting that I've been doing for months. Let's take a look at it. Number 1. The U.S. government does not know exactly where, when, or how the COVID-19 virus known as SARS-CoV-2 was transmitted initially to humans. We have not determined whether the outbreak began through contact with infected animals or was the result of an accident at a laboratory in Wuhan, China. The illness inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The U.S. government has reason to believe that several researchers inside the WIV became sick in autumn 2019, before the first identified case of the outbreak, with symptoms consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illnesses. Number 2, research of the WIV. Starting in at least 2016 and with no indication of a stop prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, WIV researchers conducted experiments involving RATG13, the bat coronavirus identified by the WIV in January 2020, as its closest sample to SARS-CoV-2, 96.2% similar. The WIV became a focal point for international coronavirus research after the 2003 SARS outbreak and has since studied animals including mice, bats, and pangolins. The WIV has a published record of conducting the gain-of-function research to engineer chimeric viruses, but the WIV has not been transparent or consistent about its record of studying viruses most similar to the COVID-19 virus, including RATG13, which it sampled from a cave in Yunnan province in 2013 after several miners died of SARS-like illness. WHO investigators must have access to the records of the WIV's work on bats and other coronaviruses before the COVID-19 outbreak, As part of a thorough inquiry, they must have a full accounting of why the WIV altered and then removed online records of its work with RATG13 and other viruses. So what essentially the State Department is saying here is that we know, number one, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting gain-of-function research, as I've been telling you since June of last year, working with coronaviruses. Number two, we know that they did work with a coronavirus, RATG13, which, according to the State Department, is 96.2 similar to COVID-19. And we know, number three, that they did alter or change online records about their work on that RATG13 at some point after the coronavirus became a worldwide pandemic. These are facts that the U.S. State Department is putting forward, not conspiracy theories and not misinformation online. And then the State Department goes on to acknowledge what I've been telling you since last June, that the U.S. funded that research. Quote, the United States and other donors who funded or collaborated on civilian research at the WIV have a right and obligation to determine whether any of our research funding was diverted to secret Chinese military projects at the WIV. Again, as I've been telling you, over $3.7 million. Now, if you haven't seen my earlier reports or a few months later, an interview I did with Dr. David Martin, we talked in depth about what has happened as a result of the U.S. funding that research, where it began here in the United States, how long it went on here, and the fact that that research in 2013 was offshored from the United States and to several labs in China, including the Wuhan Virology Institute. This is not conspiracy. This is all public document in black and white that we have presented. So right now, I'm going to leave you with that interview with Dr. David Martin to give you the background on where this virus came from and what we know, the facts that we know about the study that was being done on gain-of-function research on coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
This is a great conversation and one that really deserves an entire expose, because the fact of the matter is the NIH made the determination to stop gain-of-function research. And as we show in the letter that was sent to funded organizations, the one we made reference to is the one that was sent to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, specifically directed at the coronavirus architect of chimeric mutations of coronavirus, Dr. Ralph Baric. And as we showed in the film, what the letter said was that the NIH had concluded that the work that was being done potentially was problematic. At the bottom of the letter, it basically said, since your grant is already funded and ongoing, we're not telling you to stop. Co-funded grants, funded both by the Chinese government and by the United States Department of Health and Human Services through NIAID, Anthony Fauci's organization, and through the National Institutes of Health generally. Now, here's the tiny problem. We, as a nation, in 2012, going into 2013, decided that the work that was being done crossed an ethical and potentially legal line, and we, as a nation, stated we weren't going to advance it. Every one of the letters that was sent to every funded researcher, both domestic and foreign, all came out with the same statement that said, you're not supposed to do the research, but ... This is a recognition that the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Disease, Anthony Fauci's own organization, specifically took the will of the people and suborned it without question in writing in these letters that essentially said, keep funding. And that's where we have a tiny bigger problem, because that tiny bigger problem is that many of the grants that were going to the active chimeric coronavirus researchers, many of those grants were ongoing and evergreening grants. There's a thing called an R01, a center grant, which is one of the instruments through which the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation and others get funding to researchers. In many instances, these evergreening grants were ones that effectively, based on the NIH's own written statement, said, while we're going to tell you that we think your research is problematic and potentially unethical or illegal, we're going to go ahead and look the other way and allow you to do it. And that included funding graduate students who also themselves had joint appointments both in the US and China.
Yes, and there is no question about that, but there is another question on top of that, which goes back, it's almost the precursor question. The why. Why was this deemed to be immoral? Why was this deemed to be possibly illegal? And from what I have seen of documents at that time, there was an honest debate going on within the scientific community of whether or not the essentially mutation or the alteration of coronaviruses to make them attach more easily to human cells was the right or wrong thing to do. Have you found that as well? Is that what that debate was over?
Yes. In 2005, Ralph Barrett made a presentation to DARPA. This, by the way, is not only a public record, but it's on his professional CV. In that presentation and in subsequent work, there was an awareness that coronavirus represented a very interesting mutable pathogen, which would allow you to potentially build, both for offensive and defensive purposes, means by which a population could be either inoculated or infected. When DARPA gets involved, obviously the funding trail becomes much more problematic. But we do know that in 2005, the United States Army and DARPA began a process through which they started manipulating the coronavirus, specifically by taking two different strains of coronavirus and amplifying pathogenicity of the virus. Now, you don't have to be a scholar, you don't have to be a geneticist, you don't have to be a medical ethicist to realize that when you begin the process of not only in your own labs, but with international graduate students present from all over the world, when you have the ability to start showing the world how to manipulate a pathogen for potentially offensive and defensive military applications, the risks that are associated with that start going through the roof. So we have a period from 2005, when we know the DARPA initiative got underway, to 2013, when Dr. Barrick submitted in grant applications information about a super pathogen, which was his chimerically altered coronavirus. We know that during that period of time, and as you know, it's overlapping the period of time that MERS came out, which was the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which most people seem to forget because it didn't really land with us here. But during that period of time, we know that a highly virulent form of the pathogen was lab created. And we know that mutation was funded by and was supported specifically both by DARPA and by the National Institutes of Health.
Guys, that is the interview for today, and obviously it's a very important interview, so I'm going to ask that you share this content with as many people as possible. Now, it's very hard to do that nowadays because social media is so locked down, but if you want to get these reports sent directly to your mobile device, just send me a text to the number that's on your screen right now. We will send reports just like this directly to your mobile device.